Okay, let's dive in. We've got a really interesting source today. It's basically excerpts from a news report about this pretty intense press conference.
Yeah, intense seems like the right word.
Definitely. So the core of it is Michelle Malkin, the commentator, attacking Canada and Prime Minister Mark Carney, and then Carney's response, which was very fact-heavy.
Hmm.
So our mission here really is to get past just the back and forth and understand what arguments were actually being made about the U.S.-Canada relationship, the tensions underneath.
And also how well Carney actually defended Canada's
Yeah,
position, right?
exactly. How effective was his pushback?
And the setting itself is quite telling, isn't it?
Oh,
The Aldua Conference Hall.
yeah.
They mentioned the Canadian, EU, and Japanese flags.
Right. It's like Canada saying, we have other friends, not just looking south.
Precisely. It signals these global partnerships. And the journalists there, CBC, CTV, Globe and Mail, sure, but also CNN, BBC, NHK, New York Times.
Yeah, so clearly this was seen as having, well, bigger implications than just a domestic spat.
Absolutely. International eyes were on this.
And you have to remember the context, the mood music going in. Trump's tariffs 20% on goods, 10% on energy. That's serious economic pressure.
Plus those 51st state comments hanging in the air. That wouldn't have gone down well.
Not at all. And this is all happening after Carney's election win in April 2025, where apparently 7.3 million Canadians voted early, suggests people were already, maybe a bit anxious.
Engaged, certainly, and probably concerned about these very tensions. Which brings us to the first question from the CBC.
Ah, yeah, straight into the economy.
Right. Pointing out Canada's GDP growth was 1.1%, below the 1.5% expected. And asking about the impact of those Trump tariffs. I think they mentioned 25% by then.
Yeah, it seems like they might have gone up. And the fact that 70% of Canadian exports go to the U.S.
So the question is basically, how do you avoid a recession in this climate? It's a direct hit.
A tough opener. And Carney's response, he seems to come out swinging, but with numbers.
Yeah, he starts listing investments, that $10 billion in clean energy since 2019.
Claiming 50,000 jobs from that and a 20% emissions cut. So trying to frame it as a positive, forward-looking strategy.
And then he pivots to trade diversification. The CETA agreement with Europe boosting exports 12% annually, he says.
Another $10 billion, 50,000 jobs linked to that, and MOUs with Japan and the UK through this Canada AI hub.
Generating $15 billion, apparently. He's painting a picture of Canada deliberately looking beyond the U.S.
But he doesn't forget the U.S. reliance either. Brings up the oil, 34% of U.S. crude coming from Canada.
That's a huge number, $412 billion annually. It's a definite point of leverage.
So his initial pitch is basically, we're resilient, we're diversifying, and don't forget, you need us too.
A pretty comprehensive defense, strategically hitting key areas, energy transition, global trade, AI, and that crucial resource dependence.
Then the conversation shifts. A BBC journalist steps in, asking about immigration.
Right, focusing on the plan to welcome 395,000 permanent residents in 2025. Canada's population is around 41.5 million, so.
So the question is, can housing and healthcare actually cope with that influx? It's a practical concern.
And Carney frames immigration primarily as an economic plus. He puts a figure on it, $50 billion annually to the economy.
And breaks down where immigrants are working. 15% in healthcare, 20% in tech. Vital sectors.
He also addresses the strain directly, mentioning plans to build 300,000 new homes.
And that $8 billion investment in healthcare to hire 10,000 nurses, aiming to cut wait times by 30%. He uses Ontario as an example, I think.
Yeah, giving his specific target. And he also brings up the safe third country agreement with the U.S.
What's the significance of mentioning that there?
Well, it suggests Canada feels it has a managed process for asylum claims at the border. He mentions a 30% drop in irregular crossings because of it. So it's like saying, we have systems in place.
Okay, so he's acknowledging the challenges, but presenting solutions and framing immigration positively.
Exactly. Emphasizing prioritizing citizens, but seeing immigration as part of the solution, not just the problem.
And then things seem to really kick off. Michelle Malkin jumps in.
Yeah, described as interjecting, so maybe not even called upon.
Sounds like it. And her comments are, well, inflammatory, accusing Canada of being a haven for criminals.
And the northern border. A freeway for 20,000 illegal leaches yearly. Very loaded language.
Absolutely. Calling it a threat to America's security, it's a direct attack, really changes the tone.
Completely shifts the dynamic from policy discussion to accusation.
How does Carney respond to that?
Initially, quite calmly it seems. He just repeats the facts he'd already mentioned.
Like the $50 billion economic contribution.
Yeah, that. And the percentages working in healthcare and tech, mentions the screening for the 395,000 permanent residents.
And the safe third country agreement again.
Right. Basically, sticking to his data points, not engaging with the rhetoric directly, and then he adds a little jab,
Oh, what was that?
suggesting the U.S. might want to focus on securing its southern border.
Ooh, okay. A bit of deflection, or maybe just pointing out a perceived hypocrisy.
Could be read either way,
Hmm.
but it's measured pushback, using facts against the fire.
But Malkin doesn't let it go. She escalates.
And this time it gets personal. Calls Carney a globalist stooge.
Wow. And accuses him of ditching Canada for London's ivory towers.
Yep, saying he's selling out Canadians to parasites. It's moved way beyond policy now.
That's pure character assassination.
It is a clear attempt to undermine his credibility by attacking him personally.
So Carney has to respond to that directly.
He does, but by pointing to his record, he brings up leading Canada through the 2008 financial crisis.
And stabilizing Britain during Brexit. That's a big claim.
It is. He contrasts his results, as he puts it, with Malkin's division, essentially saying, I build things, you just attack.
Trying to rise above the personal insults by highlighting achievements.
A classic tactic, reasserting authority based on past performance.
Then Malkin pivots again, this time to healthcare.
Calling it a socialist healthcare farce.
That old chestnut claims wait times in Ontario are up 30%.
Yeah, and that Canadians are actually going to the U.S. for care. Paints a picture of total system failure, a betrayal, leaving people to rot in endless queues.
Strong words again. Healthcare is always a sensitive point.
Definitely. And wait times are a known challenge in Canada, so it's an area critics often target.
How does Carney counter this one? Does he deny the wait time issue?
No, interestingly, he acknowledges it's a challenge they're tackling. He brings up that $8 billion investment again, the 10,000 nurses, the goal to cut wait times.
So admitting the problem but highlighting the action being taken.
Exactly. But then he goes on the offensive, comparing the systems. He contrasts Canada's per-person spending.
Which was $5,782 with universal coverage.
Right, against the U.S. figure.
Yeah.
$10,637 per person, but with 28 million uninsured.
That's a stark comparison.
And then the killer point. No Canadian family faces bankruptcy over hospital bills, unlike, he claims, 530,000 American families every year.
Framing it as compassion over profit, that's powerful.
It really resonates with a different set of values, contrasting the universal approach with the market-based U.S. system and its potential pitfalls.
Malkin must have come back on the economy then.
She does. Calls Canada a pack of deluded dreamers, points to the 1.1% GDP again, says they're wasting billions on a broken system while people can't afford to live.
So linking the social spending back to economic weakness.
Trying to paint it as fiscally irresponsible.
And Carney's response.
It's interesting, he links healthcare and the economy again, mentions the plan for 300,000 homes. That's an economic stimulus too, right?
Sure, construction jobs, materials, etc.
And then he brings up the impact of Canada's retaliatory tariffs on the U.S.
Oh, so turning the tables.
Exactly. He cites 3,000 pharma jobs lost in New York, a 15% drop in Kentucky's bourbon sales. Specific examples.
Targeting the effects in the U.S., he's saying the economic pain flows both ways.
Precisely. And reiterates that Canada cares for citizens without forcing them to beg, contrasting Canada's system saving lives with the U.S. system where millions are gambling with their lives.
Okay, so he's consistently reinforcing that values difference alongside the economic arguments.
Very much so. Then the focus shifts back to trade strategy more broadly.
This was the BBC journalist again, right?
Yes, asking about deepening ties with Europe and Asia, specifically to reduce that reliance on the U.S., especially with the tariffs in place.
Makes sense. What does Carney say?
He goes back to CETA, the 50,000 jobs, the 12% export boost worth $10 billion annually.
And future plans.
Mentions negotiations to expand tech and agricultural exports by another 15% by 2030, aiming for $5 billion more.
So, concrete targets and the AI hub.
Brings that up again, too. The MOUs with Japan and the UK generated $15 billion last year, a 20% increase from 2023.
Impressive growth.
He also mentions a $2 billion investment in NORAD.
The defense partnership. Why bring that up in a trade context?
Maybe to underscore that the relationship isn't just trade, and that Canada contributes significantly to joint security, implying value beyond just economic figures. His conclusion is that Canada's future is global, not tethered to one market.
Even though 70% of exports still go south, he's signaling intent, I guess.
Intent and existing progress in diversification.
How does Malkin react to this talk of global reach?
Pure dismissal. Calls Canada's $2.5 trillion economy puny compared to America's $25 trillion.
Ouch. And brings back the insults.
Oh, yes. Calls Canada America's filthy backyard and accuses it of leeching $412 billion in exports. It's just contemptuous.
That range, $412 billion, seems odd compared to the earlier figures.
It does. It feels almost dismissively vague after Carney's specific data. And Carney picks up on that vagueness or maybe the inaccuracy with a very specific counter.
The oil again.
The oil again. That 34% of U.S. crude supply, the $412 billion annual value. He directly refutes the leeching narrative by highlighting this massive contribution.
And he adds another layer too, right, about switching suppliers.
Yes. Points out it would cost the U.S. $20 billion and take years to switch to, say, Saudi oil because U.S. refineries are designed for Canadian crude.
That's a really specific practical constraint. Undercuts the idea that Canada is easily dismissed or replaced. He challenges the idea that size dictates strength.
A very effective counterpoint, using concrete facts about a critical resource.
Then the focus shifts to the AI hub specifically. An NHK journalist asks about it.
Yeah, basically asking how Canada can compete with Silicon Valley giants, especially under economic pressure, even with that $15 billion in exports and the 20% growth.
It's a fair question. The scale difference is huge.
Carney highlights the $5 billion invested in AI research since 2017.
Creating 20,000 high-skilled jobs, mainly Ontario and Quebec.
And emphasizes the partnerships with Japan and the UK again, framing Canada's niche as ethical, sustainable AI.
So not trying to be Silicon Valley, but carving out a specific, maybe more values-aligned role.
That seems to be the strategy he's outlining, playing to different strengths.
I'm guessing Malkin wasn't impressed by ethical AI.
Not remotely. Calls the whole thing a child's toy compared to Silicon Valley.
And back to the personal attacks.
You guessed it.
Right.
Repeats the globalist sellout line. It seems to be her go-to insult.
So what's Carney's move this time?
He stays firm. Repeats his leadership credentials 2008. Brexit highlights the AI hub's success again. The $15 billion, the 20% increase.
And then he redefines patriotism.
Yes, his patriotism is building a future for 41.5 million Canadians. A direct contrast to her rhetoric. It's inclusive, focused on domestic progress.
Making her attacks seem almost irrelevant to the task of governing Canada.
That seems to be the intent. Okay, next topic. Clean energy.
Malkin's take. Let me guess. Socialist scam.
Bingo. Calls it a socialist scam. Claims the $10 billion investment jacked up Ontario energy prices by 15%.
And says it's choking Canadians, robbing them just to impress Europeans.
Hitting on the cost of living angle, trying to connect green policy to financial hardship.
Does Carney acknowledge the price issue?
He does. Calls energy prices a challenge, but pivots quickly to the benefits.
The 50,000 jobs created across Canada, hydrogen plants, wind farms.
Right, and the 20% emissions reduction since 2019. He's balancing the cost concern with jobs and environmental progress.
And brings up the oil again. He really hammers that point.
He does. That 34% of U.S. crude, the $412 billion. It's his trump card on energy dependence. He frames Canada as becoming a clean energy superpower, and even suggests the U.S. could learn from them.
A bit cheeky, perhaps?
A little bit, yeah. Positioning Canada as a leader, not a follower, in the energy transition.
Malkin's response to being told the U.S. could learn from Canada.
More dismissal. Naive dreamers wrecking your economy for green fantasies, she says. Claims ordinary Canadians are paying the price.
Sticking to her core message, green policy hurts the economy and the people.
But Carney counters again, emphasizing the 50,000 Canadians employed in the sector, and then he brings back the oil refinery point.
The cost for the U.S. to switch from Canadian oil.
Yes, the $20 billion cost and years of disruption to switch to Saudi oil. He directly asks what that would do to American gas prices.
Turning the economic pain argument back onto the U.S. side again.
Exactly. He asserts Canada is leading the world while Malkin is stuck in the past. It's quite a direct confrontation on this point.
Okay, what about the tariffs? Canada put retaliatory ones on the U.S. too.
Right. Malkin calls those $40 billion tariffs a pathetic tantrum.
Claims the huge $25 trillion U.S. economy barely feels your pinpricks.
And predicts Canada will be crawling to Trump for a deal in weeks. Pure assertion of dominance.
Does Carney have specifics on the tariff impact like he did before?
Oh, yes. He lists 4,000 auto jobs lost in Michigan, a 12% drop in Wisconsin dairy exports.
Targeting specific states. Politically sensitive ones.
Precisely. He mentions they targeted swing states and that governors there were lobbying against the Trump tariffs. He calls Canada's tariffs surgical precision.
So not just a tantrum, but a calculated move designed to create political pressure within the U.S.
That's the argument. Yeah, and he throws in the oil dependence again, and the cost of switching, for good measure.
He really doesn't let that go.
It's clearly seen as a major point of leverage.
Then Malkin seems to make a direct threat about U.S. bonds.
Yeah, it suggests if the U.S. dumped its holdings of Canadian bonds, he mentions $50 billion, it would collapse Canada's economy like a house of cards.
That sounds serious. Is that feasible?
Well, it's a dramatic claim. How does Carney respond? Does he seem worried?
Not according to this report. He stays unwavering. Points to the CETA deal adding $10 billion a year, the AI hub's $15 billion with its 20% growth.
So reinforcing the positive economic indicators.
And emphasizes the diversification again trade with Europe, Asia, basically saying Canada isn't as vulnerable as she suggests. He says Canada is reshaping global markets while she's stuck in an outdated world.
Projecting confidence and a forward-looking perspective against her threats.
And then comes Malkin's final attack, and it sounds like the most insulting one yet.
What does she say?
Asks, why does Canada keep pretending to be independent? Calls Canada America's pathetic leech.
Wow. That's incredibly blunt.
Accuses Canada of hiding behind NATO, sucking up $412 billion in trade, calls it a filthy backyard, and a global laughingstock. Just a torrent of insults.
That goes way beyond policy or even personal attacks on Carney. That's an attack on the entire country's identity and sovereignty.
And the reaction in the room, predictable, I guess.
Outrage.
Yeah, says the hall erupted. A CBC reporter shouts, Canada's been independent since 1867. An NHK journalist apparently makes a pointed remark about Newsmax, Malkin's outlet.
So the press corps pushing back, too.
And Minister Chrystia Freeland condemns the disrespect, demands respect for Canada.
So a united front from the Canadian side present.
Then Carney delivers his big rebuttal to the leech accusation.
How does he tackle that one?
Facts again, but powerful ones. He points to Canada's $2 billion investment in NORAD, protecting North America, including the U.S. Arctic, so contributing directly to U.S. security.
Turning the hiding behind argument on its head.
Exactly. Then the oil, 34%, $412 billion, keeping U.S. factories and cars running. Who's leeching off whom, right?
Highlighting mutual dependence or even U.S. dependence.
And then he goes historical. Reminds everyone Canada defeated an American invasion in 1812.
Ooh, playing the history card.
And built a nation of 41.5 million that bows to no one. He tells Malkin she needs a history lesson and a reality check.
That's a very forceful nationalistic defense, combining contemporary facts with historical pride.
But Malkin is still defiant, even after all that.
Apparently.
Yeah.
Still shouting threats about America crushing Canada.
Incredible. So what happens then?
Carney's had enough. Tells her firmly to leave. Freeland orders security to escort her out.
So she's physically removed?
Yes. And apparently, she's still shouting threats as she leaves, but the people in the hall start chanting, Canada strong.
Wow. Quite the scene. Turning her exit into a moment of unity.
Seems like it. And Carney capitalizes on that moment.
How so?
After she's gone, he gives his unifying address, frames the whole confrontation as proof of Canada's unbreakable spirit.
And recaps the key points.
No, rattles off the positive figures again. The exports, the oil, the $15 billion from the AI hub, the 20% growth there.
And the domestic investments.
Hits those two. 300,000 homes planned. The $8 billion in healthcare for 10,000 nurses. The $10 billion in clean energy, creating 50,000 jobs and cutting emissions.
So reinforcing the message of progress and resilience.
Yeah. Exactly. Ties it back to history, overcoming challenges since 1867. And ends with, Canada doesn't kneel. We stand tall, united. Canada strong.
A very powerful closing statement after all that drama.
Masterfully turning disruption into a rallying cry.
And the media coverage afterwards reflected that?
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
CBC says Carney defended Canada's honor, crushed Malkin. Globe and Mail calls it a masterclass in leadership. National Post. Malkin learns not to underestimate Canada.
International reaction.
BBC says Carney proved Canada is a formidable partner, not just a shadow. New York Times notes the diplomatic fallout from Malkin's outburst, but says Carney shone.
What about Newsmax?
Defended Malkin, claimed Carney dodged issues, but the report says that view had limited traction. The overall take was that the event became this symbol of Canadian pride.
So summing up this whole deep dive then, this press conference, wow, it was way more than just a spat.
Absolutely. It really put the spotlight on the very complex U.S.-Canada relationship, showed Canada's strength in key areas, energy, AI.
And the nation's resilience, that unity when pushed.
Definitely. I think the key takeaway for you listening is that Canada, might be smaller population-wise than the U.S., but it holds real clout. in critical sectors. Oil is the obvious one, but also these emerging tech fields.
And that ability to respond to really harsh criticism with facts, but also with that united front, that's a significant strength.
It shows a strong sense of national identity, for sure.
So here's something to maybe mull over. We saw just how deeply interconnected the U.S. and Canada are, even amidst all this conflict. What does an exchange like this actually mean for that relationship long term? And maybe counterintuitively, can these moments of intense conflict actually end up strengthening a country's own sense of itself, its resolve on the world stage?